a volunteer in the archives at the Wayne County Historical Society of Ohio, and we would like to continue Part 2 of our presentation on the famous Wayne County artist you never heard about. At the end of Part 1, the old school teacher in Wayne County, Ohio, had planted the seed of fame and fortune as an artist in Benjamin Franklin Reinhardt's young mind. Joseph Reinhardt had made up his mind that his youngest son, Benjamin Franklin, should not leave home and had planned for him to take over the Reinhardt homestead because the other sons had already left or were preparing to leave the family home. One was a merchant in Pittsburgh, doing a lucrative business. One was a surveyor, and a couple were apprenticing as carpenters. Only Franklin remained unappropriated, and his father thought he should stay with him on the farm, and therefore tried to repress any notion that the young artist might have to leave home and do anything other than work on the farm. After their lease on the farm in Mohican Township ran out in 1837, the family moved to their unimproved homestead farm in Green Township, Richland County. The next 3 to 4 years were very unpleasant for young Reinhardt. His father scowled and frowned whenever he saw the boy drawing, and sometimes sternly and in a commanding way forbid him to waste his time on artwork. His father tried at every turn to keep Frank busy all the time with farm work so he wouldn't have time to draw. But Benjamin Franklin Reinhardt would not be deterred by his father or anybody else. When he was about 11 years old in 1840, he came up with a plan. The old school teacher had mentioned Baltimore, Maryland as an artistic center, and Frank decided he would go there and try to persuade some artist to take him in as an apprentice. He made up his mind that he would do any work, however unpleasant and menial, as compensation for his board and artistic instruction, and believed there would be some kind-hearted knight of the brush that would take him in. In pursuance of this scheme, he ran away from home sometime in 1840. He left his home at about dark, and to mislead his family and friends as to the direction he had taken, he walked 16 miles in the opposite direction, west, to a farm of one of his aunts, and stayed the night after telling her a lie that he had been sent to look for some runaway cattle, and the next morning she let him depart to continue his search for the cattle. He commenced walking east and traveled 36 miles that first day on foot with only a dog that had followed him from home. As he had absolutely no money, he sold that dog for $1 to pay for his supper and lodging for the night. He continued his march eastward, following the National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road, and he would draw sketches of people along the way for either lodging, food, or a small fee, and would guarantee the drawing would distill their likeness or they could have it for free. At village hotels, there would almost always be someone who would chat with him, and after learning his story, which grew to be a pitiful tale, to the extent that he was a fatherless orphan struggling to get to the home of some of his relatives, would give him permission to draw their portraits for a York shilling, which is about 12.5 cents to 50 cents. Frequently, the hotel landlord would be among his clients, and thus he defrayed his hotel bills as he traveled across the country. After walking 10 days, he finally reached his family's old homelands in Greene County, Pennsylvania, and boldly claimed acquaintance with some of his relatives, but was not received with much favor or kindness. They had guessed that he had run away, and gave him the cold shoulder and turned him away to fend for himself as best as he could. He wanted to continue on his way to Baltimore, but knew the road over the mountains was sparsely populated and foresaw that his sketching business that had gotten him this far would not sustain him over this part of the journey. He also knew his current set of homespun clothes would not make a very good impression on people once he got to Baltimore. He decided to stay in Greene County, Pennsylvania a couple of months, taking odd jobs an 11-year-old could get, like working on farms in the area, sometimes gaining a dime or a quarter in money, but often merely making his board and lodging. Eventually, he had been able to earn enough money to buy a new suit of clothes. When fall came, the national road became lively with passing drovers who were driving herds of cattle through the mountains while the road was still passable before winter set in. Reinhardt saw his opportunity to move on and joined the drovers on the road to the east. He found the drovers to be a kind, generous race of men who kept him fed and helped him find customers in the evenings in the parlors of the little country inns they passed along the way at 50 cents a sketch. It took another 8 to 10 days for Reinhardt to reach Baltimore. For the first time in his life, Reinhardt was in a big city, and he tried his best to keep his promise to himself to become an artist's apprentice. He wandered around the city looking for any artists. People laughed at him when he explained the purpose of his coming to Baltimore. No one would even give him directions to any artist studios in the city. In just 2 days in the city, he had nearly exhausted his scanty hoard of money he had worked so hard to attain after the landlord of the Black House Tavern took advantage of him by overcharging the boy. He quickly came to the conclusion that he had to trudge back to the west, and again the drovers came to his rescue along the road west, and made plenty of money drawing people's sketches along the way. After a few more travel escapades along his way west, he eventually reached his birthplace of Greene County, Pennsylvania again, and settled in at Carmichaelstown, where there was a seminary school, and he set about getting an education and paying his way by doing the chores and grooming horses for a citizen of that town. He had not been there long when a worthless old scamp named Dan Smith, having heard Reinhardt's story about his merchant brother in Pittsburgh, came to him one day and informed him that he had a message for him. This was that his brother was very anxious to see him and had promised that if the young Franklin would only come home again, arrangements would be made by his family for his regular education as an artist. This was, of course, a pure fiction, and naturally ended in a request by Dan the Scamp for a loan of $1, which was duly granted. Young Reinhardt at once started for Pittsburgh, working his way down on one of the river boats laden with flour. The captain knew his brother, and when they got to Pittsburgh, pointed out his store. With a beating heart, Franklin made his way up the stairs to the office. Here he found his brother, who had not heard that he had run away from home, and greeted him with a gruff, "Well, you young rascal, what has brought you here?" On hearing the story of his escapade, his brother ridiculed the idea of his becoming an artist and did his best to persuade him to go home. This, however, he fiercely refused to do, and it was at last arranged that he should return to Greene County, where his brother had a business acquaintance, Mr. Gregg, to whom he wrote requesting him to advance Franklin a small sum of money for clothes and schooling, and to find him a good situation. Franklin therefore stayed all the winter at Carmichaelstown, working and attending school regularly. In the spring, as soon as the roads were open, his father, who had been advised by his brother where he was, came and fetched him home, promising him at the same time that if he would be a good boy, he would give him a field on which to raise produce for himself so that he might gradually get together a little money and be independent. It was also agreed that nothing was to be said on either side about his unfortunate obsession of his becoming a painter. Reinhardt stayed at home in Ohio for another couple of years, and his parents used every effort to induce him to become a farmer. After a while, as his father saw that he still persevered in his art studies, he again grew hard and stern, and when Reinhardt announced his determination to once more leave home and make another effort to become an artist, old Reinhardt came very near to pronouncing a solemn curse against him. But all was to no purpose, and in the spring of 1843, Reinhardt again made his way to Pittsburgh, almost as poorly provided with money as when he had started off 3 years before. For his father, fearing that he would leave him, had taken the precaution of letting him make as little money as possible, even going to the length of forbidding any of his neighbors to employ him. Reinhardt's first business in Pittsburgh was to see his brother. His brother received him with a very wry face, and thinking that this determination to become an artist was merely prompted by a desire to do as little work as possible, lectured him soundly upon the wickedness of laziness. Reinhardt, in reply, offered to do any work his brother might give him to pay for his board until he could make arrangements for his education as an artist. His brother at once made him a sort of general assistant about the store. After seeing Reinhardt's strong work ethic, his brother began to treat him with great consideration, teaching him to keep books and inflaming his desire for money by showing him that he could certainly get rich if he would consent to earning money by the ordinary channels of trade and not art. However, Reinhardt would not be swayed by money and used his brother's kinder attitude towards him to gain some time off from the store to see the city, and began to look around for an artist to teach him the rudiments of art. He came across a sign painter named Miller, who supplemented his income by giving lessons in painting, of which he really had some knowledge. Miller saw the boy's talent and cheerfully gave him lessons at his usual price of 50 cents a day, artistic materials included. After a week of lessons, Miller confessed that his pupil was already more proficient than himself. His first big break as an artist started at his brother's store in Pittsburgh. Among his brother's customers was Major Armistead Beckham, the superintendent of the Western Pennsylvania Penitentiary. Major Beckham's son, Joe, frequently came to the store and soon became best friends with Frank Reinhardt, and Reinhardt painted Joe's portrait, with Joe finding the canvas and the paints. The likeness was so strikingly faithful that Joe ran off to show it to his mother. His mother was delighted, and hearing from her son the story of Reinhardt's struggles and aspirations, sent him $5, a considerable sum in those days. And she asked Joe to bring him home for a visit. The visit resulted in an order for the portraits of her children and her husband. The compensation agreed upon being an artist's outfit of supplies and the sum of $10. Mrs. Beckham was so pleased with her portraits that she set to work canvassing among her friends for more orders for the youthful artist. In this, she was eminently successful. The Western people then, as now, were only too glad to patronize home talent, and as Reinhardt really painted admirable likenesses, though of course his work was crude and his backgrounds of greater or lesser degree of hideousness, he speedily had an abundance of commissions at fair prices. That is to say, at from about $12 to $15 for a half-length portrait, which in those days was about as much as was paid to the ordinary run of artists. Reinhardt came back to town with Joe to buy his easel, brushes, and paints, and on the way resolved on the bold step of at once leaving his brother's employ and throwing himself upon the world of Pittsburgh as a portrait painter. His brother, unaware of Reinhardt's plans, began chastising him for his absence and warned him that for the future he must pay better attention to business. We can easily imagine Reinhardt's exultation as he replied that at last he saw his way to gaining his livelihood in his own chosen way, and that he had rolled out his last barrel of flour and hauled his last hogshead of molasses. His brother accepted the situation with good grace and contented himself with advising him to work hard and save his money. From this time, Reinhardt's career loses its romance and becomes the common, matter-of-fact story of an artist struggling out of obscurity and poverty into fame and fortune. After about 9 months at Pittsburgh, spent in steady work and conscientious use of such poor facilities for art study as the city afforded, he grew restless and determined to go to New York. He arrived in New York City in 1846. He made little more than a bare livelihood during his first year as a New Yorker, his only opportunity for sales being an exhibition of his pictures in the window of a little frame maker on Grand Street. He registered and exhibited some of his paintings at the National Academy of Design in 1847. In the fall of 1847, he moved down to East Broadway near Chatham Square, and having hung out his sign, starved through the winter in a very wretched and discouraging fashion. In the spring, however, the fates again smiled on him, and he fell into a good run of commissions. And in 1848, he had saved enough money to make a visit home in the grand character of a successful New York artist.